I was born in Tuam, County Galway, the last of 10 children. My father was a carpenter. My mother was a housewife, and obviously she had a lot of children to keep her going otherwise.
Playwright Tom Murphy was born in 1935 and lived and worked in his native Tuam until the late 50s.
I met everyone in Tuam prior to my going to London or New York or wherever I've been. I had met those people already. The difference was only a matter of degree.
Like most children, the young Murphy enjoyed hearing stories, but the future playwright was also developing keen observational skills.
When I was a child, there was a woman who lived across the road whose name was, well, we all called her Momo. She used to tell us ghost stories. And indeed, I remember one night a much older brother, he would have been 16, 17 years perhaps older than me, coming home, and this lovely old woman was there, and she'd been telling us ghost stories, and he came in and he was very excited. He had seen Lassie Come Home in the cinema. And young and all as I was watching her face. There was a bit of dismay on it that this other culture wasn't just threatening her. She had an apprehension of it in the sense of awareness of it and fear of it, that she was perhaps becoming redundant.
Even when attending the theatre, a similar type of people-watching took place.
I'm not sure when the first theatrical experience happened, but the town of Tuam always had an amateur theatre group, and I remember seeing Jerry Healy's The Black Stranger. A factor that took my attention more, a degree of amazement really, was the silence of the audience. That this was, if anything, more important or had a bigger impression on me than what was happening on the stage. I couldn't understand this, the collective of an audience and the rapt attention that they were paying to what was on the stage.
In his teens, Murphy did some acting with the Tuam Theatre Guild and with the technical school in Tuam, the Tech, as part of the Féile Dromaíochta. Eventually, however, he came to writing.
Noel O'Donoghue and myself, Noel was my best friend. We were both in the Theatre Guild. We'd done plays by Hugo Betti, the Italian playwright. We'd done The Playboy. We'd done O'Casey, M.J. Malloy, of course. And we were standing on the square in Tuam one Sunday morning, waiting, I think, for the pub, for the hotel to open. So O'Donoghue said, why don't we write a play? I said, what will we write about? He said, one thing is sure, it's not going to be set in a kitchen. And I said, we could set it outside a dance hall. And he said, what's the problem? I said, what do you mean? He said, there has to be a problem if it's a play. And he came up with it. He said, they haven't enough money to get in. And I said, why do you say they? And he said, I couldn't be standing here on my own talking to myself now, could I? And this was the most progressive stuff on drama I've ever heard. And this came from the very, very young Noel O'Donoghue. So we wrote on the outside.
Nobody laid out their stall as a contemporary Irish dramatist with quite the panache as Tom Murphy, that young man from Tuam, did in the late 1950s.
Critic and academic, Professor Anthony Roach.
With both his one-act play On the Outside and his first full-length play, Whistle in the Dark, here was someone who was going to take no prisoners in his dramatic assault on the pieties and conventions of Irish theatre. On the Outside remains one of the most powerful statements in its depiction of the two young fellas outside the dance. Nobody has written as well about class and economics in Irish society as Murphy has, about the disenfranchised of the earth. Whistle in the Dark is one of the great plays about emigration, because it is in the place to which they have gone, not the place which they have left behind. And it shows the battling carnies as driven by the demons which made them leave Ireland in the first place, that emigration is not just economic, but is spiritual.
I think I had written A Whistle in the Dark, then called The Arden Men, in maybe 59, certainly 60. I should say that I don't think that the overt violence in A Whistle in the Dark is the major thing. I think it's the emotional violence. I think that the family is perhaps the least democratic institution in the world, that members of families are all trying to fit in and accommodate other members. And I think that this creates inner tension and inner emotion. That's why I feel that the emotional violence has more to do with the blood knot of family, tribal ties, what I usually call a blood knot that prevails.
Something is driving it in a way that's very invisible.
American writer Sam Shepard is a fervent fan of Murphy's work in general, and of A Whistle in the Dark in particular.
But it has this power of accumulated energy, accumulated force in it that's so invisible, and it just happens. And it keeps happening and driving and driving and driving and reaching these momentous catastrophes, throughout it, And it's such a wonderful thing to see a play that has that kind of invisibility about it that becomes a force, you feel it. It's like a great piece of music, It's driven. And the father, of course, it's very close to my own experience, this father-son schism that's going on, and the way in which the father becomes maniacal without even knowing it, and the sons are just pulled along in tow. They can't even help it. Also, the way in which they're alienated from their homeland. It's very powerful that this thing takes place not in Ireland, but in the excommunicated country, in fact the country of the oppressor, that they've been extricated from their homeland, and yet driven by these tribal feelings, these sort of impotent tribal feelings now, of having to fight and stand up and what is manhood, and things like that. It's a very rich play, incredibly rich play.
I think the particular moment when The Morning After Optimism started was I had moved to London, and I was sitting in my very modest bedsit. When people are looking for autobiographical material in the plays, there are certainly autobiographical moods. And I was still a very young man in this bedsit in London, and I had some sort of feeling that I had betrayed my roots, my background. I wrote this, what I thought was a short story, which was, once upon a time there was a boy, as there was always and as there always will be, and he was given a dream his life. His mother told him, do not be naughty. Who would be naughty? No one is naughty. And there would be a lovely girl for him one day, and she would have blue eyes and golden hair. His father told him other things, the teachers, and I felt that somehow or other I was guilty about those things. It's much, much later that I realized that I could look at the thing, if you like, intellectually, and think that I had an idealized idea of myself. And the idealized self can be tyrannical, and it was tyrannizing me. I couldn't live up to this pure, scented Tom, who had been brought up by clerics and was fed a lot of fairy tales, and I perhaps swallowed them whole, and now I had to do a bit of retching to get them out of my system.
First of all, I have to say that, I admire Tom Murphy immensely, just without any sort of borders at all.
Actor Neil Tobin played John Connor in the first production of Tom Murphy's Famine at the Peacock Theatre in 1968.
It was a very, very difficult part for me to adjust to. One of the problems I had, which has nothing to do with Tom Murphy, was that I had been playing Brendan Behan, and obviously, it suited the part to be drinking pints and so on, and to have a big bloated belly and so on. And suddenly I'm this West of Ireland farmer whose potatoes are all gone, and he should be starving. And in fact, I was, fat, bloated, a big beer belly and so on. Tom was absolutely jealously guarding every syllable. And I mean syllable. But overall, it was a very, very harrowing play, really harrowing.
The play Famine and its origins is perhaps the easiest one, I find, to give people an idea of how it started. Again, I was living in England, in London, and I read Cecil Woodham Smith's book, The Great Hunger. I was very taken by it, knocked out by it. And I started to do my own research a few years later. And I discovered as I was researching the thing, was I a student of famine or was I a victim? I would consider my times the 1950s. It was the youthful and young manhood age. And I found that poverties I considered had been carried over from famine times into my own family. The encouragement to extreme thrift, which was more than thrift, it was parsimony, and it was almost superstitious. There was no point in writing a play about an historical period or occasion or event that was would be just sheer indulgence or gratuitous, and that I increasingly found that the energy I was using to write Famine, it was coming from the 50s.
The description in the introduction to The Sanctuary Lamp is that of a church, a religious place which the gods have deserted. And he says the gods rather than God.
In 2001, the Abbey Theatre mounted a season of 6 plays by Tom Murphy. Lynn Parker directed the production of The Sanctuary Lamp.
It involves these 4 characters, 3 main characters who are washed up in this place, abandoned people who are living very much on the edge of society. They find refuge, a roof over their heads, I suppose, in this place. But of course, there is no refuge from each other. So the history between the 2 men is the source of enormous contention. And this young girl, Maudie, who comes into the middle of them, who is the innocent within, acts as a catalyst for those tensions and angers. And along the way, I think he uses that situation to basically deconstruct and attack the notion of religion and the kind of solace it purports to offer.
In the early 70s, a lot of people that I knew in Tuam, I mean contemporaries, were dying or they were killed in car crashes. The car would run into a black horse on the road coming home from a dance. A next car would stop to see what happened. A third car would come along and mow 3 or 4 of them down. And as I said, there were people dying from illnesses, cancer. 3 uncles of mine died within 6 months of each other. I thought, when will this Holocaust of death stop? And I had to think that perhaps it wouldn't. Now, at the same time, I was invited to become part of an international committee on the liturgy. The whole of the Missal was being translated, and I did become part of that committee. We were an advisory committee to bishops and indeed to a few cardinals. I think I had some sort of naive belief that maybe I would find some sort of salvation or redemption through this business. Undoubtedly, the other people on the committee were very, very fine people individually. But I found that collectively, frankly, I thought it was a bit ridiculous. And also I felt that it was wrong for me to be fashioning prayers, if you like, which I did not believe in myself, for other people. So I resigned. I resented also the fact of, I go to Connemara quite a lot, and looking at the mountains, and they couldn't care less. They could absorb everything. And it was perhaps driving down to Connemara on one of those occasions, and here's where RTE comes in. I heard Andy O'Mahony interviewing Father Peyton, who is the Rosary priest. The family that stays together prays together. And he was telling Andy that as a youngster, he went off to California, where he had an uncle, a priest, and the uncle gave him a job, sweeping up the church in the evening and locking it at night. And Father Peyton said he would always take a last peep in at the sanctuary lamp, almost like saying good night to it. And bingo, in my head, I felt something had definitely happened. The sanctuary lamp, a church. Here was I, long-faced, and feeling that the weight of the world was on me, and thinking of dead people and dead friends and so on. And I thought of the light, and that no grief could put out that light. It is a constant light. It's signifying the constant presence. But I didn't see it in terms of the church putting it there. I felt that man lit that lamp. That man lit the bonfire in the distance. Man lights the candle in the window. And that not all the grief in the world can extinguish that.
1983, Joe Dowling called me in and said, I want you to do this new play by Tom Murphy called The Gigli Concert.
Tom Hickey played the dynamitologist J.P.W. King in the first production of the Gigli Concert at the Abbey Theatre in 1983.
I was, on the one hand, excited and thrilled, and on the other hand, really upset because I couldn't figure out how I was going to do this. Patrick Mason would direct and Godfrey Quigley would play the other role and Kate Flynn would play the part of Mona. There were these huge arias of speeches, but it was clear that this was an extraordinary play. But how to do it is another matter.
What's, I think, most brilliant about the Gigli Concert is it is so multi-layered.
Director Patrick Mason.
And of course, the brilliance is having the pseudo-therapist, JPW, suffering his own breakdown simultaneously, and the two men both becoming obsessed with the voice of Benjamin Ogilvy. Then you have this other remarkable element of Mona, this strange woman figure in the center of it all, with this, again, beautiful and extraordinarily delicate dilemma. You really couldn't get, I suppose, a richer mix in that way, and yet it's done so deftly through patterns of narrative, flights of fancy, wonderful kind of comic, almost routines that develop between, particularly the two men. There's a sort of madness in the air about it. The play always threatening, the characters always threatening to spiral out of control into their fantasies. And then, of course, the most fantastic thing happening, that, JPW ends up singing like Gigli. And it's like the playwright's final trick is to say, well, yes, someone is going to sing like Gigli, and it's not who you think it is. It's got a kind of playfulness. And I think this is the most striking thing about Tom Murphy as a playwright for me. He plays dangerously and brilliantly with all the elements of theatre.
In the 1980s, I would say, we became very conscious in Druid that we needed to engage with new writing.
Artistic Director of Druid, Gary Hines.
Engage with it in the level of working with an established writer, not just through presenting new work by young writers. Tom Murphy was a writer that I fell in love with on the page. So basically we started talking to him about whether he was interested in becoming a writer in association with the company. And a very simple idea that we would do one or two existing works and that he would also write a new play for the company. The first production that we did was what became Conversations on Homecoming. Over the course of discussion with Tom, he talked about the original production of The White House and how The White House was written in two acts, one called Speeches of Farewell and the second Conversations on a Homecoming, and how he always had a difficulty of knowing which act should come first. And I believe in the course of the Abbey production, in fact, experimented with that in performance. But he talked about the fact that he wasn't happy that he had really sort of resolved that. And we continued to talk about it, and eventually the idea emerged that perhaps the Speeches of Farewell act was not necessary, or perhaps the play would work without the Speeches of Farewell. So Tom did rewriting of the second act, if you like, which, well, second or first, Conversations on Homecoming, to incorporate it as to help it as a standalone play. It wasn't a major rewrite that I remember. And we were very happy with it and presented it in Druid in 1985. It was a huge and immediate hit for the company.
The next thing I did for Druid was Ballyagongora. This Ballyagongora has a very odd genesis. I've got a photograph of my grandmother, who is sitting on a rather elegant chair. I did say to a friend of mine at one stage, this is my grandmother, isn't she beautiful? And this friend said, well, actually, Tom, I think she looks like a cross between John Wayne and the Pope. Which description isn't too far out at all, because the woman is enormous and big and huge hands. I had felt that as a writer, I think that writers, artists generally they're probably selfish. They are selfish. I don't think there's much of a choice. And I felt that I'd been very neglectful as a father, and I thought I will write a story for my children. And I'll get copies of this picture of my grandmother, and that will be stuck on the cover. And I'll write 5,000 words and tell them something about their grandmother, whose name, well, she was always known to us as Momo, rather like the woman across the road who used to tell us the ghost stories, who was Momo too. So with the view towards doing something special for my children, I started off on this story, which I decided to call Ballyagongora. 3 words, obviously, Ballyagongora. I wanted a name like Puddle Beyond the Marsh, something that would intrigue children, something that would have to work out and say, what on earth is this? This is a very long word. So I started to write Ballyagongora. I got to 5,000. I got to 8,000. And Christmas was coming, so I thought, sorry children, dinky toys again. And I pursued the piece as a play.
In Tom Murphy's production of Ballyagongora, which was done as part of a season of his plays in 2001 in the Abbey, I played Mary.
Actor Jane Brennan.
The language that the grandmother uses is quite archaic and wonderful, and she's almost like this monster in the bed, repeating bits of this story over and over again. It reaches a kind of crisis point with Mary, and she gets the idea that if they can get the grandmother to finish the story, that it will somehow help them to move on, get on with their lives. It's fascinating, this mesmeric journey to the point where Momo can actually finish the story?
In the middle 80s, I decided that I'd have to come to terms with a type of writer's block that I've had all my life to do with prose. And I sat down and wrote a short story. And I forget what it was called, but it was a woman's name. And then I tried another short story about a woman, another woman's name. So I thought, well, maybe the cohesive factor in this, if I can put 7 or 8 stories together, will be a man writing 7 or 10 short stories about women, and each story would have a woman's name. But I started the third one, and it took off. And I wrote this novel called The Seduction of Morality. While I was writing it, I thought, well, this is a play. So when it was published and on the bookshelves in shops and that, perhaps a year or whatever later, I said, no, perhaps I can consider looking at it as a potential play. There was another factor happening in my mind at the time, and that was to do with the 3 principal characters in the book. That's Vera, Finbar, and Henry. That they wanted to replay the game with me, and they were not going to be dictated to, and they wanted a different resolution, an ending to the piece, so which in fact the play achieves. That, of course, became The Wake.
The character of Vera in The Wake, which I played in the Abbey Theatre, which the first production was directed by Patrick Mason, that's another of Tom's very lonely, isolated characters. There's one fantastic scene in The Wake which kind of it's a scene of enormous humanity, where she decides to have a wake for her grandmother, one that the family never had and should have had for her, and she wants to pay tribute to her grandmother, but also to take one last look at her family and remember them not just as the greedy, awful, selfish, terrible people that they are, but to see their humanity. And there is an evening of song and recitations and, everything from A Vision of Connacht in the 13th century by James Clarence Mangan to My Little Grey Home in the West. It's a very, very funny scene, but it's also very moving because it's her final hurrah with her family, and she totally cuts the ties with them after that. And I think the ending, where she eventually gives them the hotel, and it's this incredibly generous gesture, considering the way they've treated her. She doesn't end up on her own, isolated, which is her great fear, but she ends up free and independent, and I think the ending is triumphant, where she goes off on her own and leaves them forever.
I think approaching Tom's work, I've done, 3 of his plays, and they are very difficult because he does have a very, very particular shape to his language.
Actor Frank McCusker played Kerrigan in The House, which was produced at the Abbey Theatre in the year 2000.
I remember actually The House, the very first speech that I played Kerrigan, and he's welcoming back Christie, who is coming back from London. Kerrigan is a solicitor in the town. Christie is overworking the building sites in England. And he opens the door and he says, if I can remember, he says something like, "Be the Hokies, the hero is back. Home is the hero, the swallow, Golondrinas, and Christopher the traveller. Come in, you're welcome. Yes, at this delightful hour of the night, sit down. Whiskey you'll be having, I suppose." And I looked at this on the page and I thought, how on earth? This is just a welcome. But I have to say, knowing Tom and Tom's own way of speaking was a kind of an access to me, and hearing him was an access to how I ultimately cracked, or attempted to crack, the delivery of that particular opening line, which is the most difficult opening line I've ever had in a play. But when I got it, I felt terribly confident.
In Alice Trilogy, I wrote the first play, which is called In the Apiary. I didn't want to write an Act 2 to accompany that first play, or indeed an Act 3. In the conventional way of writing plays, an Act 1 will dictate how an Act 2 will happen, and stuff that will be finger posts, as they're called, that will be in Act 1 will have to be fulfilled. The destinations that they're pointing to will have to be arrived at. And I'm interested in other forms of art, like music and painting, particularly painting in this case, that I thought, would it be interesting to paint 3 portraits of this woman and let them be independent of each other in terms of dramaturgy? And that's what I tried to do, so that the scope of Alice Trilogy is 25 years. Alice is 25 in the first play. In the second play, which is called By the Gasworks Wall, she's 40. And in the third play, At the Airport, she's 50.
I played Alice in Alice Trilogy in the recent production in The Peacock, which Tom Murphy directed himself. She's a highly intelligent, very sharp, imaginative woman, but she's trapped as much by her own personality as by any sort of outside social restrictions. She's unable to act, and I think she's like a female Hamlet in that way, of course on a much smaller canvas, but she's as depressed and disillusioned with herself as with anybody else, with anyone in her life, with her husband or her family. And so she's a kind of an anti-heroine in that way. She isn't proactive. She knows what she needs to do to be fulfilled, but she can't seem to do it.
The future and the present. I thought a few days ago that I was engaged in some sort of rock climbing exercise because it was very arduous. Today I feel it's potholing. That I did start something some time ago, and I started from a point of daylight, and I'm in subterranean territory, and I'm looking for light. Writing, to me, is happiness. I have had the occasional, not very frequent moment through a long life in the business, wonderful moments, and I'm looking for more sort of moments which paradoxically would be, if I look at a clock and it's 7:10 in the morning, and I look at the clock next and it's 2:10 in the afternoon, that I've stepped out of time. And that's as close to happiness as one can get, I think, if one can step out of time. I would like to step out of time a few times more before the full stop happens.
The playwright in profile was Tom Murphy. The contributors were Jane Brennan, Gary Hines, Patrick Mason, Frank McCusker, Lynn Parker, Professor Anthony Roach, Sam Shepherd and Neil Tobin. The programme was compiled and presented by Sean Rocks and produced by Kevin Reynolds.